While both of these starters are offshoots of my well-maintained starter, the one on the left is 12 hours past its peak. In this experiment, I wanted to see how a starter with more acid buildup, particularly lactic acid, would affect my bread. You can read my blog post for more details about these starters. For these doughs, I used a pre-mixing method, which I'm really fond of at the moment. I already pre-mixed the flour, salt, and water, and here you can see I'm adding the starter. To avoid tearing the fully formed gluten network, I added the starter to the top and smeared it all over to completely cover the dough. The difference in the way these starters poured and spread felt really dramatic. One being loose, stringy, and spreading easily, and the other being strong, elastic, and stretching like bread dough. Next, I layered the starter in by doing as many folds as I possibly could. The goal here is to evenly disperse the starter into many thin layers throughout the dough without tearing the gluten network. I find this technique to be more effective than kneading in the starter after, say, an autolyse, because it keeps the gluten network from falling apart, leading to a stronger dough that needs less work later on. And with the high-ish hydration of both the dough and the starter, both of mine are at 85% hydration, the starter readily absorbs into the dough. By pre-mixing, we get the best of both worlds, full extensibility plus a fully formed gluten network without kneading and with minimal effort. It was so interesting to me how the acidic starter compared to my regular starter during this folding process. First off, look at how much shinier it is on camera than my regular starter. Second, because this starter had virtually no elasticity left, it really wasn't stretching much as I was folding the dough. It was just, there, and it was weirdly sticky. I covered the doughs and let them rest for 30 minutes at an ambient temperature of 73 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. After their rest, I then laminated each dough. The goal here is to give the gluten network one last bit of strength and strong tension, while also further incorporating the starter. This is really all we need to get that starter fully dispersed, and then we're good to go. This step also conveniently is a great place to add inclusions if we wanted to do that as well. Working from the middle, I stretched the dough out as far as I could without tearing. When I was working with the one on the left, I really couldn't tell if anything was different from usual. But as soon as I touched the one on the right, I could tell a major difference in how the dough felt. The one with the acidic starter was just much stickier, while the one on the right was smooth and strong. Next, I folded each dough into thirds like a letter and rolled them up, stretching the dough as I rolled it to give it one last bit of tension strength before its rest. Last, I placed them both in a rectangular proofing dish, which is great for folds and for judging bulk fermentation. I let these doughs rest again at an ambient temperature of 73 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 hour before their first set of folds. Both of these doughs seem to be fermenting well. The dough with the acidic starter really didn't feel too much stickier than the other, and they both folded cleanly. For this first set of coil folds, 5 folds was the number they each needed to regain their composure. The purpose of folding bread dough is not really to develop gluten per se, as the gluten network should already be developed. Rather, the folds work with the fermenting dough to create tension, which supports the dough's ability to hold in gas and keep its form. The process I'm using here only requires 2 sets of folds to support fermentation, yet still creates a very strong dough. After letting these doughs rest for 2 more hours, I then gave them their second and final set of folds. This set was only 3 folds, as the dough was feeling very nice, bubbly, and structured. Again, at this point, both doughs felt great, and it was hard to tell a difference between them. This last rest was 4 hours, and then I shaped the dough. That puts bulk fermentation at a total of 7.5 hours at 73 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit for these doughs. This is the most dramatic part. Watch the difference in how these doughs fall out of the container. While my regular dough on the right is strong and falls quickly, the one on the left is much slower, having lost a lot of tension during the final stretch. I attribute this expedited dough degradation to the excess lactic acid that came from the acidic starter. I think if there had been even more acid accumulation coming from my starter, paired with decreased yeast activity from the acidity, this could have been a nightmare. But because the starter was well maintained and there isn't excess built-up acid accumulation, the effects were only minor. Because my dough is well fermented and full of gas, I use a gentle shaping approach. Again, it was hard for me to tell in the moment a difference between these 2 doughs, mostly because I'm used to handling all sorts of doughs. The biggest difference here is that the one on the left clearly has less strength and is slightly more extensible. Dough that is full of gas does not need so much tension during shaping because the gas gives the dough strength. While the gas will make the loaf light and airy, it'll also help it stand tall and get a good, even exponential oven spring. After rolling up the dough and popping all the air bubbles, I dusted the tops of these loaves with rice flour to keep them from sticking to the banneton. Now, I normally use a wood pulp Banneton, which is the best because it absorbs excess moisture and vents well for continued, even fermentation in the refrigerator. However, I wanted 2 of the same size Bannetons, so I used another style. I was worried the dough with the acidic starter would completely break down in the fridge and become super sticky, which is why I used a cheesecloth as a backup. This ended up being a great thing, and I should have lined the other Banneton as well. You'll see why in a moment. After pinching the seams closed, I covered the loaves with a plastic bag and retarded them overnight at approximately 38 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit for about 13 hours. There ended up being quite a noticeable difference in how the loaves retarded. While the loaf from the acidic starter did not completely break down, it did gain quite a bit more extensibility from the increased dough degradation, causing it to rise more in the refrigerator. However, it seemed to keep enough strength and have enough gas that it still stood firm when I turned it out. Meanwhile, this is the point where I thought I ruined the experiment because my control loaf, the one in the unlined Banneton, did not come out cleanly. Apparently, these Bannetons do not absorb moisture on their own in the slightest, so my loaf did end up with too much moisture, making it hard to remove and score. I just went with it and hoped for the best, and thank goodness everything turned out just fine. One interesting thing I noticed here was that the webbing of the gluten network, which you can see from the score, was much more pronounced on my control loaf than it was on the loaf made from the acidic starter. I think this is just evidence of the fact that the loaf made with the balanced starter continues to be stronger than the one made from the acidic starter. I baked these loaves in my Challenger bread pan at 500 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes with the lid on, then at 450 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 minutes with the lid off. And here you go. On the outside, there's quite a difference in the shape of the loaves. Part of this could have been from the Banneton problem, but probably not all of it. Also, the score on the loaf made from the acidic starter popped way more, which I again attribute to the increased extensibility from the increased dough degradation. As far as crust goes, they baked up pretty much the same. Let's take a listen. Crumb-wise, there was quite a difference. I think you could call both of these loaves open crumb loaves since the crumb is pretty much open on both of them. However, the acidic loaf was more open and even, while my regular loaf was a little more wild. It's a little hard to see the complete crumb structure from the lighting. Texture-wise, they were the same. It doesn't seem like the dough from the acidic starter degraded enough to lose air and cause a dense loaf. The only thing I couldn't show was taste. There was much more of a noticeable sour flavor coming from the loaf made from the acidic starter, though the sour flavor was more like a mild yogurt flavor over a sharp cheddar flavor, due to the lactic acid. Altogether, I think the answer is yes, you can use your starter past its peak. As long as the mother starter itself has been well maintained, you might even find the results desirable. Check out my blog for more and let me know what you think in the comments.